All right, welcome everybody. So it's my pleasure to announce our speaker this week. Dr. Nancy Ryan is an economist who focuses on greenhouse gas mitigation policy, electricity regulation, and transportation electrification at E3, and handles much of its regulatory and business strategy work. She spent her career working for effective data-driven energy solutions as a consultant, a regulator, an academic, and an environmental advocate, personifying the 360-degree industry perspective that guides all of E3's work. Nancy joined E3 in 2013 after working for 7 years with the CPUC. She was appointed a commissioner by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, serving from 2010 to 2011. She also served as Deputy Executive Director for Policy and External Relations and Chief of Staff to the President, working closely with policymakers, regulators, and stakeholders in areas such as renewable energy, smart grid, electric transportation, and the implementation of cap and trade for the electric sector. Her career also includes 5 years at the Environmental Defense Fund, where she focused on energy and climate policy and dabbled in water. She's also held several positions at consulting firms. She received her PhD in economics nearby here from UC Berkeley and a BA in economics from Yale. And today, her talk is entitled Transportation Electrification and the Low Carbon Grid, Perspectives from E3's Work in California, Hawaii, and New York. Please join me in welcoming Nancy.
Okay, so Alicia, thanks very much for that introduction. I wrote it myself, so it's a good one. You hear me okay in the back? Ben, you can hear me okay? Great, all right, well, I am really happy to be here today. I have seen and met, many of the researchers and graduate students from Davis throughout my career, my multifaceted career, as you just heard from that introduction. And am, excited to get a chance to meet some of the people who are in the next generation that Davis is going to contribute to the energy and transportation and climate policy community. And that's really the spirit of our visit here today. I am accompanied by 3 other colleagues from E3 who aren't in this room, but I'll point them out when they come in. And our mission today is to introduce you all to E3, or if you already know us, tell us more about the work that we're doing, give you a sense of the breadth of the work that we do, and start to develop relationships, broaden and deepen our relationships with the community at Davis. We hope that somebody in this room will come to work for us one day, and we are growing. We're based in San Francisco with offices, also new offices in New York and Boston. We're a small company of about 50 people, but we have big dreams, and so we hope that, again, we're part of what we're doing here is recruiting, but, you also heard that I've worked in a lot of different spaces, and I think it's important to, help people who want to work in this community think through where they fit into it. And, we at E3, one of the nice things about our company is that we really work for everybody in the energy space, ranging from, we work for utilities, we work for pretty much all of the regulators, the technology companies. We've done work with NRDC and some of the other enviros over the years. So I think we have a pretty good sense of the whole landscape. And a number of you are going to be talking with myself or one of my colleagues after this meeting. And we can talk about what it would be like to work at E3, but we can also talk about where else you might fit in and who we know and how we might help with that. And I hope that we'll kind of continue this conversation going forward, and that we will see a lot of you out there in the professional community. Okay, so that's kind of the overall mission for the day. So let me talk about what I'm going to do with this presentation. So, all right, so that was I had a little bit more of an introduction to E3. And then what I want to do is talk through some of the recent projects that we have done in the area that I find most exciting, which is transportation electrification, and talk about some projects that we've done in different parts of the company where we've looked at transportation electrification in California and elsewhere from a variety of different perspectives and a variety of sort of different levels of resolution. So that will both share some of our most recent work, give you a sense of the things that we think we want to do next there to continue to solve progressively harder problems for our clients, and also give you a sense of just the range of ways that we look at things at E3. So I'm going to start with a study that some of you may have seen some of this work, like I think it's been presented at the STEPS Symposium recently, study for the California Energy Commission Actually, I wrote there that it's the future of natural gas, but that's actually the current iteration, but it's a pathways analysis, so an economy-wide study of the transition to a low-carbon economy, decarbonized economy. So I'll start with that because that really gives the broadest picture. Then I'd like to talk about two projects that we've done, one for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, which is kind of like their equivalent of the CEC, where we looked at the economics of light-duty transportation electrification in New York State. And that's one of the most recent studies that we've done where we've looked at cost and benefits of transportation electrification and shows you the kind of modeling approaches that we've used and some of the problems we're grappling with. And then I'll also talk about some work that we did for Hawaiian Electric Companies, or HECO, where we helped them draft a transportation electrification strategic plan that they filed with the Hawaii Commission. And then mixed in there, and I think actually in between CEC and NYSERDA, I'm going to talk about a little bit of work that we've done also for the Energy Commission with some automakers and a company called Nuve looking at vehicle-to-grid technology. So trying to understand at a sort of more granular level of resolution how smart charging of EVs and particularly vehicle-to-grid technology can contribute to renewable integration. So I think if I succeed in getting through all of those projects, you will get a pretty good sense of the breadth of the work that we do and the types of the tools that we use and the kinds of clients that we work with. And I will say, I often like to give the disclaimer that I am probably the least technical person who works at E3, even though they made me a partner. And I really come because I think I come more with a policy background. A lot of my experience is in synthesizing and translating sophisticated modeling work to people who are making policy decisions who often do not have that orientation. That's kind of the role that I have. And what that means for today is that hopefully it'll be easier for some of you to follow what I'm talking about. But more important, I am not the person to ask technical questions about these models or the details of the assumptions that go into them. The people who are going to come into the room in a little bit are the experts on those things, and I will point them out. And all of this stuff these are all public projects. All this stuff is up on the web, and we would welcome your follow-up conversation, follow-up questions and, discussion about them and your ideas about better ways to do some of the things that I described. So I would say feel free to interrupt me with questions, but I'm going to be focusing more on kind of who was this client and what was their problem and how did we approach it and what did we learn from it as opposed to some of the more technical details of the models. And I'm going to kind of fly pretty fast through these things, so because again the idea is to give you more of a flavor. Okay, so E3, we have 5. Actually, I think this might be out of date. Really, maybe kind of more like 6 working groups within the firm. So, and these are informal. We are not a hierarchical organization or like a rigidly structured, but we have to kind of account for everybody and make sure that they have enough to do and they get trained. And the way that we do that is that we organize people into groups that focus on particular areas of work. And people tend to work mostly on projects related to the subject area of their group, but they're not confined to that. In fact, we encourage people to work across groups, and they often do. But it's a convenient way to just kind of organize information about who we are and what we do. So, is this? That's the pointer. Okay, so distributed energy resources and rates, that's one of the bigger groups at E3. In fact, we just broke it into 2 pieces. One that deals explicitly with electrification of buildings and transportation, and I'm the partner that leads that group. And then a second area that deals more with planning on the distribution side and is led by Eric Cutter, who's a director at E3. And that is the work that really was the original home for a lot of our transportation electrification work. It grew out of work that we'd done historically for energy storage and rate design and valuing new distributed energy resources on the grid. But again, I would say that this work now really cuts across the whole firm. Asset valuation, this is a big and growing area at the company where we're really taking all of our insights on technology and policy and translating that into what we think is going to happen in energy markets and markets for related services, and understand then how that translates into the outlook for different types of companies and technologies as well as, individual power plants or, like a large pump storage facility, something like that. So the models that Eric works on in the DER area are among the ones that we, then turn around and apply in the asset valuation practice area when we're working, primarily for investors to help them understand the opportunities that are available to them. Planning, this is really a core kind of long-time function at E3. Today, it's really all about the question of how do we operate the grid safely and reliably and cost effectively with more and more and more low carbon generation. Because so much of our work is in the West, it's often renewable generation, but we work all around the U.S. and do some overseas work as well, where there may be a different low carbon resource mix. But if the problem that you are really passionate about is renewable integration, that is the group where we do that work. Market analysis, I kind of touched on what this group does when I talked about asset valuation. So market analysis is, again, really translating all of our insights from our other work about technology and where policy is heading into understanding what that means for what's going to happen for electricity prices and other financial indicators, and then in turn using that to value assets or evaluate cost and benefits of policies. And then finally, one other big group, and represented today by Tori Clark, who's not in the room yet, but our clean energy group. If any of you have ever seen anybody from E3 present on our pathways model, that's our economy-wide energy systems model, where we basically trace out pathways for deployment of low-carbon technologies to realize a long-term decarbonization goal. And we've done many studies that are very well publicized here in California for the public agencies. I'm going to talk about the most recent one in a minute. But we've done pathway studies all over the U.S. for a variety of clients, both utilities and public agencies. And some of that work is public, and some of it is very private and is informing utilities' long-term business strategy. And I said that we have one other group. Oh, the other group I didn't mention that is an important growing area is we also do a lot of work supporting large energy users. So historically, that's meant working, for example, with West Village, helping with some of the analysis about the costs and benefits of some of the technologies that were installed here, or working with University of California to help President Napolitano think through how the university system will realize its decarbonization goals. Increasingly, that group is supporting CCAs, community choice aggregators, as the CCA movement takes off in California, and CCAs have more and more regulatory obligations imposed upon them by the legislature and by the Public Utilities Commission. They realize that they need professional help, and they call us. So that's, if that's something that's exciting to you, that is definitely an area where we're doing more work. Okay, so what's the intersection of transportation, electrification, and all these different E3 work areas? So I just kind of took that slide I just showed you, and I wrote in for each of these areas some of the questions that we're thinking about in each of those areas. So the distributed energy resource group and the rates group, we've looked at, how do we get people to smart charge? What are the costs and benefits of EV adoption? How much better are they if people are smart charging? What are the right rates to have for EVs? So we've done a series of studies, mostly for utilities, along those lines. Market analysis, what's the effect of all this new load? How much new load will there be, and what's the effect going to be on energy prices, on ancillary service prices? Taking that over into the asset valuation part of the house. So what's a company that has a proprietary aggregation technology that could, sell services, flexibility services into the CAISO? What's that worth? What should someone pay for that company? How much, if I'm a technology company, how much should I invest in putting this kind of capability into a car or a charging station, or this other kind of capability? So that's the kind of work that we are doing. And the asset valuation group, one of the things that we'll do is like due diligence around transactions. The planning group there, how do we plan to meet this new load? And let's not just kind of treat it as a new load that's going to show up. Let's think about it as a new load that we can meet as it arrives and turn it into an asset to the grid. What should we be willing to pay people to shift the time when they charge their cars in order to provide services to the grid? How much is that worth relative to other types of flexibility resources that we could buy? So work, I think, that we're really going to dive into in a bigger way in supporting the Public Utilities Commission next year as it launches its next round of integrated resource planning. Let's see. And then clean energy, I'll start by talking about a Pathways project. So there again, how much do we have to electrify transportation? How fast do we have to get all the way out to heavy-duty long-haul trucks? What do we have to do in order to meet our long-term decarbonization goals? So I'll give you an example of that. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'll talk about the project for NYSERDA on primary value of smart charging and just give you a flavor of how we've been modeling our transportation strategic plan for Hawaiian Electric, B2G valuation project, and I'll start with the CEC. Okay, so who has seen Amber Mahone or somebody else from E3 present on Pathways? Okay, so just a few people. Great, right. I thought I recognized you. Okay, yeah, Amber was here last year in December at the STEPS, or in the spring at the STEPS Symposium. So E3 built the Pathways model to answer the question, if we set a given greenhouse gas reduction goal, what does it take to meet the goal? How many electric cars, what penetration of heat pumps by when, so on and so forth, how much energy efficiency. And over the last 5 years, we've done a series of studies for the state agencies, beginning with one that we did for the so-called energy principles. So the heads of CARB, PUC, CEC, MISO, and the governor's principal energy advisors. We did that in 2014 when Governor Brown was tuning up to think about what he wanted to set as the 2030 target. And we've done a series of studies since then, including one that supported the most recent scoping plan update by CARB. I'm going to talk about one that was released earlier this year where we asked the question, well, now we have SB 32, which sets the 2030 target, and we have SB 350, which mandates some programs. What's the gap? How much more do we need between the SB 350 programs or what are we going to get out of the SB 350 programs in terms of GHG reductions, and how much more do we have to do to hit the 2030 target in a way that has us on track to cost effectively get to our long-term 2050 target? So here's historic emissions of GHGs in California, a reference case of, basically what if we just stop doing anything new. SB 350 pushes us down a lot with all the, that's 50% RPS by 2030, doubling energy efficiency in existing buildings, big commitment to utility, transportation electrification programs. But here's the 2030 goal that SB 32 set, and here's our long-term, the goal we've had for 2050 for a long time. So there's a big gap between what's in SB 350 and what else we have to do. So what we used Pathways for in this study was to construct a series of, we started by constructing an SB 350 scenario that said, okay, let's suppose we realize everything that we set out to do in SB 350. How far will that get us, and what sort of persistence do those measures have, and now what else do we have to do? And so we did 10 different mitigation scenarios, because the whole point is that there are multiple ways to get to the target, and there's a lot of uncertainties about which technologies will work or not, and the level of adoption that we may see. So let's see what the different pathways look like and think about the contingencies and the interactions and the optionality. So one thing that all of these 10 pathways have in common is that they rely or they involve all four of what we call the pillars of deep decarbonization. So very deep energy efficiency, very high levels of electrification in buildings, transportation, and industry, much higher distribution of low carbon, or much higher usage of low carbon fuels, including renewable hydrogen, advanced biofuels, and then significant reduction in non-combustion emissions. So and what you see here is these ranges represent kind of the high and low amounts. Oops. The high and low amounts that we see under those different mitigation pathways. But what you can see is that they all are big changes. One thing, now focusing on transportation, today light-duty vehicles represent about 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions in California. And obviously are a major focus already of policies for climate and clean air. And then other kinds of transportation are, also a significant slug of reductions. If you look at what happens between now and 2050, almost all of the emissions are going to be driven out by light-duty vehicles because we have almost complete, in a compliant pathway, we have almost complete electrification of light-duty vehicles. High level of electrification in other modes of transportation. And really the remaining emissions are in areas that are, very hard or very expensive to electrify. One of the things that's come out of this work is we've tried to think through kind of where are all the places where we could get emissions reductions across the economy. One of the things that we have concluded is that we really are running up against a constraint on the amount of sustainable biomass feedstock that's available. So we don't have enough sustainable biomass feedstock without going to purpose-grown crops to both get renewable biofuels into the fuel tanks of all the remaining internal combustion engine and diesel vehicles on the road and into the pipeline that brings natural gas to homes, offices, and industry. So that's a significant constraint in the long run and something where our perspective has become kind of progressively bearish over time. And is kind of the bad news that we've had to deliver to policymakers is that you're going to have to think about, either decarbonizing the gas pipeline and, rapidly electrifying homes, or come up with some other solutions for some of the hard to electrify transportation applications. Do you have a question? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question because I kind of skipped over that. Yeah, so Pathways is not an optimization model. It's a tool to assemble scenarios that, so you can think of them as kind of like each one is kind of a handcrafted scenario with some sort of kind of ad hoc optimization going on in the analyst's mind and putting something together that makes sense. But this is not like you're running a model to spit out the best result. It's more like, here's one thing that we could do, sort of a set of initiatives that leads to kind of this set of technology deployment, and here's how it works together, and here's another approach. And I'm not presenting any of the results today, but we do cost comparisons across the different scenarios, and one of the factors that is usually goes into play when an analyst constructs a pathways scenario is if I put too much of this in and it's ridiculously expensive, it's not a plausible scenario, so I'm going to go a different direction and kind of come out with a scenario that tells an interesting story of a plausible path that we might go down, but that isn't, but it's going to pass the laugh test. Yeah. Yeah, good question. So this model does not have any macroeconomic factors in it. We have, I believe in some states where we've done this, either we or another contractor has actually kind of done a parallel macroeconomic analysis using something like, RIMI or IMPLAN to look at what the employment impacts are and the shifts across sectors, but we haven't done that in this work. And that's not an aspect of, it's not an aspect of choosing scenarios. Yeah? Yeah, good question. So I'm going to say one thing quickly about it, and then I'll point you at Tori when she comes in, because she's the expert on that. But I think the way that we've approached this is that we have said that we'll kind of take our population ratio weighted share of the U.S. biomass feedstock. So we do assume that we import some biomass or biofuels. but we don't kind of assume like, okay, well, we're just going to take everything because other states aren't doing anything yet. Okay, so just let me give you a sense of sort of the sweep of the transformation that we see here. So what this chart shows is how the composition of final energy demand changes from 2015 to 2050, and overall, much less energy is used across the economy because we're using it much more efficiently. The big change that happens is that there's a lot more electricity being used, and a lot less natural gas, or at least fossil natural gas, as well as a lot less, almost no gasoline. So we're really forcing out the fossil fuels and mainly relying very heavily on electricity going forward. And again, if you think back to the slide I had up before, the remaining use of fossil fuels is really focused in those sectors that are very difficult or expensive to electrify. So aviation, some aspects of industry, maybe long-haul trucking. So that's the extent of the change. We have some hydrogen in this case. This case I'm showing you is one of the 10 cases that's our high electrification case. We've also done hydrogen cases which would have more hydrogen, renewable hydrogen. So that's the extent of the transformation. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to drill down into a few places. So this is in 2030, 6 million zero-emission vehicles in California. ZEVs account for 60% of new sales, 32% electrification of buses, 20% of rail, 27% at ports. So, and then I think this is kind of an eye-popping number. 50% of new sales of water heaters and HVAC are electric heat pumps. So, very high penetration of electrified technologies in these consumer segments. Very high achievement in efficiency. And in this case, 74% zero carbon electricity. So that's got some large hydro nuclear in it. So that's more like 60% RPS under the current definition. And then, by 2050 goes to something like 95% RPS. We always keep some gas in these scenarios because we find that it's just, and I'll have much more to say about this in a few minutes, but much more cost effective to keep gas-fired capacity around, to use as a reliability resource. And we have successive days of like dark, cold, rainy days where the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. It's cheaper to keep the gas plants around and burn a tiny amount of gas every now and then than to have massive banks of batteries around that we only use every now and then. Yeah, the question? Yeah, thank you for that question. So, the way that we have built these scenarios is we have some smart growth in them, and so we do have some reduction of VMT, consistent with, SB 325, basically consistent with the law on the books. But we've deliberately built these scenarios to kind of be seen as plausible and not requiring high levels of sacrifice and big changes in our way of life. But what I think is actually interesting with all the rhetoric around the three revolutions in transportation is I think that we need to do some scenarios that look at those kinds of transformations that might be made possible, because then that's really more of a technology change and customers choosing new things, and it's kind of you're pulled to that outcome instead of pushed to it wearing a cardigan sweater. So I see that as I have that on my list of sort of my to-do list of things that we want to do next. Yeah. I am not sure where that is in here. I think efficiency, is really about like using less energy as opposed to demand management, which is really about moving it around. And I'm going to have a lot more to say about that. I see another question. Okay, so I'm actually going to kind of blow past pathways because I want to get into some of the other stuff. But let me just show you this. So this is what happens to electricity demand. So basically doesn't change a lot until about 2030. So effectively what's happening is that the ramp up in electrification in buildings and transportation is really just canceling out the aggressive movement on energy efficiency. But then it really does start to go up, quite a bit. We're using a lot more electricity by 2050, and that is a combination of, some additions in buildings, light-duty electric vehicles, electrified trucks and freight, and then making hydrogen to use I think in this case, probably there's some hydrogen in the natural gas system, and then there's also hydrogen being used for goods movement. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, so the hydrogen is made with renewable energy, and we use flexible hydrogen production as a mechanism to balance out production of renewable energy. Yeah, so we basically make hydrogen while the sun shines. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a Tory question. So I'll point her out when she comes in. Okay, so how are we going to make all this? We're going to use a lot more electricity. How are we going to make all this electricity? So this being California, we're going to mainly make it with renewables. So a lot of solar, central station solar, rooftop solar, a lot more wind as well. And as I said before, we're going to still burn a little bit of natural gas, even as far out as 2050, but it's really just going to be, on those, cold, dark days in winter when that's a better, it just makes more sense to keep those plants around and have some gas to burn in them than to have those big banks of batteries that we hardly ever use. So one of the big findings that comes out of Pathways is that if we want this transformation to be cost effective, then we really need to have a deep integration of the increasingly electrified transportation sector. And by electrified, I also mean electric drive, like hydrogen, H2 fueled. So higher and higher levels of integration between this increasingly electrified transportation sector and an increasingly renewable electricity sector. And so as a practical matter, what that means is using charging of electric vehicles and manufacture of hydrogen as flexible resources to balance out solar production and limit the amount that we have to curtail solar and wind generators. And what I think is really kind of an interesting touch point about this transformation is that this is really, we're going from a fuel-driven energy system to a capital stock-driven energy system. And it's really, and so the optimization problem is really about sort of which capital resource is going to be your slack resource, which thing is going to be idle. So you minimize sort of the collective idleness, and then you decide, which is the one it makes the most sense to have idle. And, the challenge today is, of course, cars are idle most of the time. And we want them to be less idle. So they could be less idle by being used more with more sharing and pooling. They could also be, their batteries could be less idle by being assets to the grid. So, that's the direction that we need to go. Okay, so I'm going to skip the rest of this and go on and start talking about some of the work that Eric has been leading in a project, an EPIC project financed by the CEC, actually financed by the California electricity ratepayers via the CEC, to really dig into this question of the role that electric vehicles can play in helping to balance an increasingly renewable grid. So, Pathways gives us this grand economy-wide perspective and kind of shows us the level of effort across the different pillars or sectors of the economy and gives us an indication of how they need to work together. We have other modeling approaches at E3 where we can then sort of drill down into some of those questions about, exactly how should the electric system get built out over time, and how should we, how can we assure that when we dispatch it in real time, that we're always going to be able to meet demand. So we've done some work with what we call the Resolve model, which is a tool that we built that combines long-term capacity expansion. So what's the right rate? Like what kind of plants should we build and when should we build them? And how much storage do we need along with the solar that we're building? So it combines that unit expansion logic with real-time dispatch logic to assure that what we put together, actually works and can be dispatched in, the full variety of load and weather conditions that could be experienced in the future. So that model enables us to get a better sense of what do we need flexible resources to do and what's it worth to the grid. So I kind of just told that story, so I'll skip ahead. So, basic story is that if we have a lot of electrification and a lot of renewables, but they're not very flexible, we're going to have these days, like a spring day, when we aren't using a lot of heating or air conditioning. So here's our load, the black line. So our load is pretty stable during the day. And we're going to make oodles of renewable energy during the day. We have some storage, and we charge the storage that we build during the day, and we discharge it at night. But we have so much solar that we can't absorb, and that gets curtailed, and so that's wasted. That's a capital asset that's underutilized. Or, in our high electrification case, where the electric vehicles and buildings too have some dispatchability, then we have a big electric load during the day because many cars, for example, are being charged at work on these days or at park and ride lots. And will not then go home and charge in the evening. We don't have to have as much, so we use a lot of the energy through dispatchable buildings and vehicles. We still have some stationary storage or dedicated storage that we charge up, and then we have a lot less curtailment. So the question is, how do we make that future be the one that we get, and what do we need, like what's it worth to get there? Yeah, question? Yep. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, so I feel like it's really early days, right, on this question. And first we have to ask, like, sort of, how much do we think we need and what's it worth? And then, we need the utilities out there doing, and others out there doing programs and pilots figuring out, like, will they do it? What's the best way to get them to do it? What do we have to pay them? What's the right technology? What's the right business model? What's the right, customer interface? Because, yeah, these are people. These aren't, these are... And I think if there's one lesson from, the whole world of personal transportation, it's that, like, mobility and, like, the option to have mobility is incredibly valuable to people. I mean, why do they spend $30,000 or $50,000 to have a dedicated personal vehicle that's idle 96% of the time? That's more option than action. So I think, this is, anyway, so we need to really figure out if this resource is there. Okay, so Resolve, I'm not going to go into all of this, but I'll just say, so Resolve, as I said, it's a model that we constructed to specifically do long-term planning for very high renewable energy systems. We've used it in California to support the Public Utilities Commission in their integrated resource planning process, the cycle they just completed. We developed the scenarios that were the basis for all the IRPs that were submitted by the utilities, or at least were supposed to be the basis for all the IRP plans that were submitted by the CCAs and the utilities. We did it in Hawaii, and I'll speak about that in a little bit, to support Hawaiian Electric Company's power supply improvement plan, which is their roadmap to meet Hawaii's 100% RPS by 2045 goal. We've done it in other states and for other utilities. And fundamentally what this model is doing is, again, asking this basic question of like, what's the, what asset should be the slack asset? Should I kind of have, what's the right balance between storage and renewables and, and gas and other flexible resources on my system? What's the least cost? So that's kind of the low point there. What's the least cost portfolio that I can put together that meets the reliability standard and also is consistent with the RPS goal? So a very complex, sophisticated model. There are people here with me who can talk about that with you if you're interested in that. But that's the basic question that it's asking. And by the way, Eric, if I say something dumb, please feel free to chime in. Yeah, I'm doing my best with this. But so this is a very nice chart that Eric presented the other day at a CEC workshop, which describes kind of the way that we think about how successful vehicle grid integration can reduce the need for storage, and as a shortcut or as the means to answering the question, what's it worth to the grid? So here, I guess, what's 42? Is that today, Eric? Okay. Okay, so we're pushing down the emissions and we're pushing up the renewables, and what we see is lots more solar, some more wind, and in our reference case, a lot more storage. If we then let Resolve dispatch EVs as a storage resource, or dispatch some part of the fleet of EVs as a storage resource, then we need a little bit less solar and we need a little bit less stationary storage. And the reason for that is that it's twofold. It's a direct, like one-for-one substitution of the battery and the EVs for the stationary battery. It might not be the same EV every day because you have an aggregation model and you have someone like ChargePoint or Internoc, dispatching a whole fleet of EV batteries, and they guarantee that they'll get just enough to meet the program. But we're substituting the EV batteries for the stationary batteries and paying them something. And then because we have found a lower cost resource to balance out the solar, we're able to have more of it, and we don't have to overbuild solar quite as much to enable curtailment. So we build less solar and we build fewer batteries if we have more stationary EVs. So that's the way we solve today using Resolve to understand what the value of flexible EVs is. And here in this case, this is a total resource cost metric. So basically all-in cost to the economy of the RPS and I guess the cars and what we pay the cars. Eric, actually, why don't you just explain that? Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, just, yeah.
So that's the total cost of the portfolio.
So yeah.
So we're building about $200 million less cost to the system with the flexible
Yeah.
represents the value
It's about a 10% reduction in the total resource cost of the RPS if we can capture flexibility from some of the EVs, not all of them. Yeah. Yeah.
The total resource cost there. So how do you think about kind of accounting for the resource cost of the EVs themselves? Do you think of them as sort of like their cars that are going to be bought anywhere on the system, or does that total resource cost include buying a lot of additional?
So for a model like this, like there's a lot of things going into it. It's a very simplified representation of an incremental cost of like a vehicle relative to an ICE. And we may have a little adder for aggregating, probably not. We're probably just assuming they're capable of being dispatched to the grid. We don't have any kind of analysis of what that means for
But we should think of these two values as including some marginal value for EVs and still having a lot of
Yeah, so, yeah. temporal resolution. Do you know, Eric?
I believe these cases are out to 2030. Not to get too deep into resolve, has 37 representative days that are dispatched hourly, and then drawn from a sample to represent all the days in the year, and that's done to kind of keep it operating fast. But it's designed to represent an hourly dispatch.
So here we're kind of answering the question really kind of from the utility and the regulator's perspective of, when we're directing, we're approving the utility's portfolio of resources that they're going to bring in as part of the IRP process, again, sort of what's it worth from the consumer's perspective, from the ratepayer's perspective, from California's perspective to get the flexible EVs into the portfolio, and then that kind of helps us then would lead to the question of what do we have to pay them, in order to get them to do this, and is it worth it to ratepayers? So this, it looks at it that way. We've also, we also get asked this question by technology companies that want to understand how much money they could make, with their V1G or V2G technology, and understand, what are the potential revenue streams that are available if I can actually, through my technology or my customer-facing business model and or a combination of those things, capture this flexibility and make it available to the grid. And how much, so how much money is there that I could get? And when I first started working on EVs, like nearly 10 years ago, there was a lot of hype about V2G, and most of the focus was on frequency regulation. I think part of that was because there was a very well publicized study from University of Delaware that had some astronomical figure for how much money could be made from selling regulation services into PJM, and everybody, a lot of automakers said, like, I'm going to put, V2G on my car, I'm going to make, I'm going to generate all this revenue from, selling regulation services, and we're going to use that to buy down the cost of the car. Well, what our work shows is that, and this is actually drawn out of work that we did with LBL for the PUC, looking across the whole suite of advanced demand response programs, because of course we have to tell the automakers, it's not just the cars, like houses can do this too, office buildings can do this too. So, how big is this regulation market? How big is the value pool that's actually out there? So what we see in these two cases that I just showed you, like a high renewables case and a low renewables case, is that the frequency regulation is pretty valuable on an annual basis, but it's a pretty but not for very long. It's a pretty shallow market, so it gets saturated pretty quickly. So, I look at that as like, sort of a big fight over a small pie. Not surprisingly, if you think back a couple of slides to the load shape that we looked at, the big opportunity is really with load following or shifting and shaping load. Longer duration storage or, shifting from, night to day during, like your spring and fall low load periods, for example, that's really valuable. That's really, that's the big pie that everybody should be aiming for. So that's your workplace charging story. And it's also your seasonal story. It's not going to be the same every season. I think also, it's really more, the value is most in, in the spring and fall in the middle of the day. So, the behavioral story that goes with that is not that, it's not that simple. This is also a solar story. So this is a California story. It's an Arizona story. It's not a New England, New York story so much. So I think for automakers, that's the kind of thing that they really need to understand is that, they need to build, capabilities into these cars that are going to be able to work in different ways in different markets where there's different low carbon energy resources. And so I think that's to me the most interesting takeaway from this. All right, I'm not going to talk about this. Eric has built a great storage model with some many colleagues over the course of several years that he used to look at V2G. If you want to know about that, you can talk to Eric about it. I probably need to talk to Eric about it myself. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears now and talk about two projects that where we were really focused on EVs and specifically what utilities should do to support the rollout of EVs in their service territories. So I'll start by talking about some work that we have been doing for the last year and a half in Hawaii, and then I'll close by talking about some work that we have done in New York. And I'll pause to introduce Tori Clark. Quickly stand up, Tori. So Tori is a senior managing consultant, I believe, managing consultant in the Clean Energy Group. So Tori is our today's expert on the pathways model, has worked on many different pathways projects, and anybody who has questions about biofuels, Tori is a great person to ask those questions because she has thought about them a lot, including Tori told me on her way up here at the Dixon Walnut Ranch, which is probably familiar to many of you. Okay, so Hawaiian Electric Company is an investor-owned utility. It serves the islands of Oahu, Maui, Hawaii Island, the big island, and I think Lanai. It's got three operating companies, Helco, Miko, and Hiko. And they are regulated, so they serve almost all of the load in Hawaii. There's a cooperative that serves Kauai. But Hiko, obviously serves most of the customers and most of the energy. Hawaii is probably almost unique in the U.S. today in that it still has a lot of electricity generated with oil. And they are, there they are out in the middle of the Pacific, the most isolated piece of land anywhere on the globe, and they're heavily dependent on oil for making electricity, for refining gasoline, which they actually do there on the spot, and putting that into cars. And then, of course, there's a huge amount of petroleum consumption to support all of the tourists coming and going from Hawaii on vacation from the U.S. or on their way someplace else. So the state has a goal to reduce and ultimately eliminate its dependence on imported petroleum. And it has an official mandate adopted by its legislature to achieve 100% RPS by 2045. Am I walking out of camera coverage? Probably. Okay, great. So Hawaii, also really interesting state, has a very kind of active Public Utilities Commission, which really tried for a number of years to lean on the utility to kind of modernize, to accept that its customers really were very interested in renewable energy, on doing rooftop solar. A few years ago, the commission issued a document called, I think, the Inclinations, which was basically like a 45-page tongue lashing, which essentially said, you guys get with the program. I mean, these are the things that we expect you to do. It's a really interesting regulatory document that kind of articulates a vision of what a modern utility should look like in terms of its responsiveness to customers, its approach to grid modernization, its embrace of clean and renewable technologies. So very well written and uncharacteristically short for a regulatory document. So, and then they kind of had a series of directives to HECO, do this, don't do that. Can't you read the signs? So one of the things that HECO did that we supported was that they put forward something called the Power Supply Improvement Plan, in which they outlined how they would transition their generation fleet and incorporate rooftop solar to meet that 100% by 2045 RPS goal. So, and I'll show you an example of some of the scenarios that we used Resolve to build for them to support the PSIP. And then in parallel, they'd already been doing some experimentation with supporting EVs on Hawaii. The utility had gotten permission several years ago to build to build out and operate some fast charging stations. And they went back to the commission and they said, well, we want to make some more. We want to build some more charging stations. And the commission said, really, we want to see what your plan is. Yeah, you can finish what you've had authorized. You haven't built all of those yet, but you can't get anything else until you tell us what your long-term plan is. So those in the decision on the charging stations that was really just about a page and a half saying, write us a long-run, transportation electrification strategic plan telling us, what you intend to do in the short, medium, and long term to support electrification and how that's going to relate to what you're doing on rates and demand response and grid mod and so on and so forth. And we have a long-standing relationship with HECO. Our managing partner has worked for them for 20 plus years as a consultant. Like I said, had done the PSIP scenario. So they called us up and they said, hey, do you guys know anything about EVs? And I said, well, funny that you should ask, because I just sat down and wrote a marketing deck 2 weeks ago describing how we could use all of the capabilities that we've built up with our other EV projects to support utilities doing electrification strategic plans. So they hired us, and we spent a little more than a year, we started a little more than a year ago to help them on the strategic plan. They filed this document in March of this year with their commission. We helped them with their stakeholder outreach and made sure they talked to, not just the usual suspects, but also we got Lyft and Uber in there and made sure we got representatives from the OEMs to come out and talk to them so that they were really thinking broadly and thinking long term. We did a lot of cost-benefit modeling for them, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. They wanted to really understand what the implications would be for their distribution system and then how that electrified fleet of vehicles was going to interact with their increasingly renewable electric grid. And, because not only as a state is Hawaii, isolated out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but each island is an isolated grid. There's no interconnection between the islands. And so it's kind of like the islands within islands challenge. And making it even more interesting, each island really has pretty distinctive resources available. So you can't just analyze one island and then take it to the next one. So for the document they filed in March, we looked at Oahu, since that's where most of the load and people are, but we've just completed some work looking at Maui and Hawaii Island for them, and they're going to be filing that along with some updated Oahu numbers later this month. So unfortunately I can't show you those results, although I can talk about them generally. And I'm sure some of you all know CalSTART. They worked with us on this, and they were really a great resource because this was also a comprehensive plan, so it wasn't just light-duty vehicles. We looked across pretty much any kind of thing with wheels that you could electrify. And Yasna Tomic from CalSTART came out and helped us kind of just be apprised of what the state of development was of all these different technologies. So this is a project where, I'm going to go back and talk more about modeling, and I've sort of mainly talked about modeling so far, but wanted to note that a lot of what we did on this project was really more sort of walk and talk consulting, where we sat down with people at HECO and sat down with their stakeholders and including, the industry and the auto industry, as I said, and thought through, what does it make sense for HECO to do? Because utilities tend to think that they are omnipotent and can fix everything, and they have access to lots of ratepayer money if they have a generous commission, and they often have big plans, but they're not always realistic about where they can really make a difference. And so this funnel diagram, which is hideous but much enamored by everybody who was involved in this process, really represents this, we walked them through this discussion, where we asked a series of questions which really boil down to, of all the things that HECO could do, what does it really make sense for them to do? So the conclusion was we are not going to build a vast network of charging stations, but we may build some to make sure that there's a critical backbone, that can withstand some of the inevitable turmoil, as players come and go and business models fail, and we're going to test out, different ways to do integration and some other things like that. We're going to help the transit agencies as they integrate buses into their fleets. So the plan kind of actually walks through, I think, 10 or 12 specific measures that they intend to undertake over the next 10 years, and kind of the rationale for why they're going to do them. And I think their commission is going to look a lot more favorably on the things that they bring forward because they will have thought this process through and engaged stakeholders in doing it. I've seen a lot of failed utility applications at commissions all around the U.S., including here in California, because they really didn't do a good job of engaging stakeholders, and maybe some guy in the C-suite was like, I've got an idea, and go write an application and get this through the commission, and then it doesn't happen. So this, I think, is an interesting project, and we'll see We'll see whether I'm right about that, but I think the odds are better. Because they're going to spend some ratepayer dollars to support electrification, it was really important to make the case that electrifying transportation is beneficial to their customers. And we used a cost-benefit model that we've built and used in over 24 studies at this point. It's called EVGrid, and it does a lot of things, but one of the things it does is to look at the costs and benefits either of electrification per se or of a particular program a utility might undertake to support electrification, and asks what are the net benefits, or the benefits minus the costs from different points of view. And in Hawaii, the 2 points of view that they were interested in were what they call the energy wallet perspective, which is also sometimes called a total resource cost perspective. So that's a pretty broad societal view. It takes into account, how much more does the EV cost relative to a conventional car? What does it cost to build a charging infrastructure to serve it? What does it cost to make the electricity that goes into the EV? Federal tax credits from a state's point of view are like free money, so that's a benefit. The person who buys the car saves money on O&M, that's a benefit. They avoid buying gasoline. In a TRC, we don't count utility bills because that's a transfer within the economy between the person who pays the bills and the utility that receives the revenue. So TRC is really sort of what's the impact on the economy. The thing that's left out of that is any attempt to value the environmental externalities. So if you factor that in, then that's usually called a societal test. So they wanted kind of more of a straight, dollars and cents, real economy test. And then what they call the utility customer perspective, if you're familiar with the energy efficiency world, that's also known as the REM test, or ratepayer impact measure. So it asks the question, are people who buy EVs paying more or less for their electricity than it costs to make the electricity? So it basically compares the rate that they pay for electricity to the marginal cost of producing the electricity. So, and that gets down to who's subsidizing whom. Because there's often, you'll often hear, people at commissions or ratepayer advocates say, this is, low-income customers are subsidizing like the rich people who can afford to buy EVs. And that's generally not true just through the construction of utility rates. Now, if you have some sort of a generous program where there's a ratepayer-funded subsidy that goes to the person who buys the car, that's a different story. But, the REM is just asking the question of, do they pay more or less than it costs to make the electricity they use? So the other question that was, so I'll come back and talk about those cost-benefit tests, but the other question these guys were interested in, and the CEO himself asked me this question when I was briefing them on this work, is, so, we burn oil today when we make electricity, and eventually we're going to push that out as we go to 100% renewables, but we're still going to be burning oil in power plants for a number of years to come. So if we have a lot of EVs on the road in Hawaii, and they're using electricity that's made with oil, are we actually going to use more oil and, and have more GHG emissions as a result of going electric? So what we did was we said, okay, let's look and see what the emissions are from the gas and diesel that's going to be used in cars that are still conventional vehicles in the interim, and then how much petroleum is being used and the GHGs from them for the electricity that's going into cars, and let's see what happens to your overall petroleum usage and your overall GHG output. So this chart, which we originally made an answer to his question and then was in the document they filed with the commission, shows them emitting 2.3 million tons of CO2 from tailpipes in 2015. It's down a little bit in 2025 with some EV adoption, and there's some incremental output, some incremental GHGs from the gasoline, sorry, from the oil in the power plants. A little bit more in 2035, but you can see this is just a product of the much more efficient use of fuel in making electricity than in running an running an internal combustion engine. So the incremental output from the incremental emissions from the power plants is minuscule compared to the amount of emissions we reduce from tailpipes. And then by 2045, the oil plants are all closed, and there's only a little bit of gasoline still being used, or gasoline or diesel still being used, and in some vehicles that are off-roading or something like that. So that was, from their point of view, that was a good answer. So they liked these answers too. So here, the energy wallet perspective. So again, that kind of total resource cost or economy-wide cost and benefit. These are the savings that result from EV adoption. So big saving is avoided gasoline use, avoided O&M, and then getting the federal tax credit. And then on the cost side, that's the electricity supply cost. That's the incremental cost of the EV. And that's the cost of the charging infrastructure in just a straight unmanaged case. So on a per vehicle basis for the cohort of vehicles purchased from 2018 to 2045, the net present value of electrification is $1,700 or about $1,800 per vehicle. So that's a benefit to that flows to the economy in Hawaii. It's primarily realized by the person who buys the car, because it's primarily the effect of substituting cheaper locally made electricity for gasoline made with imported fuel. If you wanted to run something like Implant or REMI, then you would sort of look and see what are those people spending their money on, that they weren't, the money that they were previously spending on gasoline that they're saving now, what are they spending it on? And, chances are they're spending it in the local economy on goods and services and so on. But again, we didn't do that. The other question we asked is what about smart charging? So back to the, the question that I posed before, what is it worth to have smart charging EVs on the grid? So in this case, what we saw was that the way that we approached this is we said, okay, in our base case, we're just going to assume that everybody charges when it's convenient. So most people, they come home in the evening, they plug in, they charge. Most of their charging is over in the evening. So this is the electricity demand from charging EVs. Our EVGrid model lets us, show people different prices or give them different options, and then kind of does an optimization. In this case, there is an optimization where the optimizer times the charging of the vehicle to minimize the total bill for charging, subject to a constraint that there's a very low probability that it won't have enough charge to complete the trips that it needs to complete. So it's informed by driving data, and we can kind of dial up. We have a parameter in there. We can sort of dial up or down, sort of based on how much risk aversion we want to assume that somebody has about the chance that they won't be able to complete a trip. So to me, this is very much an engineering solution. Having been trained as an economist, one of the things that I want to do with this model is kind of get more economics into it. So there's something for you to think about if that's what you work on. But any event, so when we tell the optimizer model, okay, we're going to say that half these people now can charge at work. They have charging infrastructure at work, and they have, a favorable rate to charge at work. Then the optimizer, the optimization protocol shifts a lot of charging into the work hours. The people who can charge at work, a lot of them choose to charge at work because we've given them the opportunity and the incentive. The other half who don't have the opportunity to charge at work still just do convenience charging and charge at home. And the effect of that is to push the cost of service down quite a bit. So it gives us a 50% increase in the value, the total resource cost value of light-duty electrification. So smart charging is valuable. And right now we're really doing this is one example of how we did an illustrative case. I'm going to show you another one where we did it in a different way. To me, this work is good to set up hypotheses that now need to get tested in pilots that utilities and other stakeholders all over the country deploy to see, do we really get this behavior? Do people respond the way that we've assumed here? We need to set up a virtuous cycle where there's good evaluation of those pilots to figure out, particularly from a process perspective, what worked, and have better models so that we really begin to understand what this resource is and what we can build into like the resolve model and the pathways model in the long run for what we can really do in this sector to complement the change in the electric sector. Okay, the other perspective I mentioned that these guys were interested in Hawaii was in the so-called REM test, or what they call the customer perspective. So again, how much do people with EVs pay in via their rates for charging versus the cost of serving them? And again, a comparison between the unmanaged charging case, where there's a REM benefit of about net present value over the lifetime, about a little more than $500 per vehicle, more than triple when we have smart charging. So again, just a consequence of, big reduction in the cost of serving that load by shifting it to low-cost hours, because what we're doing is we're shifting it off to, we're using, actually, let me skip ahead to that. So I said before that the really interesting thing to me about Hawaii is like that the resource mix really differs across the islands. And so these are cases from the Power Supply Improvement Plan, their long-term generation plan that we helped them for. So this shows one scenario that's compliant with the 100% RPS that shows how their generation mix on each island is going to transition from 2020 to 2045. So the gray is all, primarily oil, and a little black is coal. Yellow is solar, orange is storage, green is biofuels, and blue is wind. And so what you see on Oahu, and also the scale is really different. This goes up to 8,000 megawatts. For Hawaii Island, it goes up to 700. So, yeah. This is what they would install in a scenario for how they would build out their grid in order to serve load while meeting their RPS. So it's a scenario. Yeah. So on Oahu, they have a lot of load. That's where most of the people are. The only real resource they have is solar. So as they go more and more renewable, they're going to build more and more solar, and they're going to curtail it a lot, and they're going to build a lot of storage. So it's really not a great story for their resource. Their wind resource is mainly offshore wind, so that's super expensive. Totally different story on Hawaii Island, where they have lots of onshore wind, and lots of relatively inexpensive solar. So if you look at kind of the ratio of solar to storage, they don't need as much storage for their solar because they have higher cap factor on it. So that translates into a really different story for the role that smart charging of EVs is going to play in balancing out the renewables on those grids, and different stories about the value of smart charging on those grids. So on Oahu, if you smart charge an EV, you're backing out this really expensive solar, which needs to be combined with storage. So you're backing out, a more costly resource than onshore wind with a pretty good cap factor on Hawaii Island. And you're replacing it with a flexible resource, that can substitute for the solar. So if you think back to the slide I showed you earlier in the talk from the CEC study about the value of flexible load, there's sort of that twofold value. You back out the expensive resource, and you provide a new flexible resource. So when they file the new work that we've done for them later this month, what you will see, if you happen to look at that, is that the value of smart charging, there's a positive value of smart charging on all of the islands, but it's much higher on Oahu than it is on Hawaii because of the difference in the resource mix. I'm just going to touch on a couple of things here because I want to leave some time for questions. So last project I want to talk about is one that we are also just wrapping up. This is in New York State. In this case, our client, as I said before, was NYSERDA, so a public agency that's kind of has a mission kind of similar to the CEC. We ended up working on this project with Ford Motor Company, gave us some data, ChargePoint gave us some data, so we got some actual data on charging and driving behavior in New York State. The way that NYSERDA's budget process worked out, they ended up saying yes to all three consultants who proposed to do the project. So we ended up partnering with ICF and MJ Bradley on this project and kind of divvying up the work between us. E3 did all of the modeling, and those guys were more responsible for preparing inputs and drafting the report. And it has been a very long project in the making. I think, Eric, we wrote this proposal in like fall of 2015 or something. Anyway, long time ago, but but it's its time has finally come because the New York Public Service Commission has opened a proceeding to look at the role that their utilities should play in supporting transportation electrification. Unlike California's utilities, who are so hot to trot and just want to do everything, the New York utilities are really kind of like, can you just leave us alone? And so I wouldn't say they're going to be dragged kicking and screaming into it, but they are not hyperventilating at the thought of doing a lot on this front. And they kind of quietly helped us, and we've talked to them about the work, but they're kind of just hanging out, waiting in the wings. So I'll just skip ahead and say what was interesting in this project was that we worked in 3 different parts of the state. So we worked with Con Ed, which serves New York City and Westchester County, so metro area, New York metro area, so obviously super dense population, high concentration of really affluent people. Then Long Island, so basically suburban, and then upstate New York, service area of National Grid, so around the Syracuse area. So 3 very different regions in terms of density, car ownership, housing stock, driving patterns. And what we did for them was to think through, we really need to think through that, the way that people charge and drive is going to depend on the kind of charging infrastructure they have access to. And what is realistic to provide to them is really going to depend on what the housing stock is like and whether or not, they drive to work and would have an opportunity to charge at work. So we kind of put together this decision tree to work out what kind of access people would have. And we would say, okay, do they drive to work or not? If they do drive to work, can they charge at work? And if they do charge at work, what do they have at work? And then that kind of gave us 12 different bins that tell us what people's primary and secondary charging location is. So if you can charge at work, you mainly, if you can charge at home, you mainly charge at home. If you can't charge at home and you can charge at work, you mainly charge at work. If you can't charge at work or at home, then you're captive to public chargers. And then what we did was we used some work from Davis, actually, on, access to different types of charging by type of housing, and then another survey on the distribution of the population across different housing types to kind of create these bins and a size for the bin for the access to charging. And then that access to charging gave us, where people would be able to charge during the day. So here's someone who has a BEV, and they can charge at work, and they have level 1 at home. So during a weekday, let's see, this is confusing to me. During a weekday, they have level 1 at home and level 2 at work, and they discharge when they drive to and from work. Gold is driving, and blue is the level that they're able to charge at. And then on the weekend, they can charge at home during the night, and then during the day, they may go out, and then they would have access to DC fast charging. So we had weekday and weekends. Anyway, more complexity than you need to know, but the idea was really to use this approach to come up with a way to differentiate between the different regions of the state that represented the different housing stock. And then we built up from that driving and charging profiles and then ran those through our cost-benefit calculator. And interesting thing about New York is that, I'm sorry, everything has a different color scheme because these are all in the color schemes of the clients, and they all have different preferences. So in this case, we're comparing New York Metro, Long Island, and upstate, a base case, so not managed charging, just convenience charging, and a societal cost test, and now we've monetized the externalities. Emissions are, avoided emissions from driving are higher than incremental emissions from making electricity with gas. They save a lot. EVMT savings is avoided gasoline and O&M, and then they get the tax credit. And then over here, they pay more for the vehicle, they pay for the electricity that goes into the vehicle. Or sorry, this is society, so somebody pays. And somebody pays for the charging infrastructure. And a few things to notice. So first of all, if we have a little green box like this, it says we have net societal benefits. So all three regions, there is some net positive societal benefit from light-duty electrification. So that's the first punchline. Second one is like it's low downstate and high, relatively high upstate, and that's mainly because it costs so much more to make electricity in the New York area and to install charging infrastructure because everything is more expensive in New York City. Looking at it from the driver's point of view, the prospective EV purchaser, there we see that if you add up the extra bills they pay for charging and the extra cost of the EV and compare that to what they save on fuel and O&M and getting the tax credit, people in the New York metro area don't come out ahead. And that's because electricity is expensive in the Con Ed service territory, and so rates are high in Con Ed. So it's not a favorable proposition. It is still on Long Island and more so upstate, and that's largely a function of it's just the electricity is cheaper and it's cheaper to do everything else up there. And then last thing I'll show is this is another example of us thinking about smart charging. So in this case, what we said, okay, like what's the technical potential of smart charging? If we could get like ideal behavior modification, as we call it in this story, and if like every customer saw and could respond to a real-time rate that reflects like the hourly cost of service in that hour, how would they charge? So we simulated that in this case. And again, it's obviously not realistic, but it's kind of gives you a sense of like what is the best that you could possibly get. So this is for Long Island. This is a day out of a draw of 8760. So this shows the area chart is the average, or it's the hourly cost of service. So it's this is the energy, the T&D, the capacity. So this is probably like a peak summer day, and this is the rate that the customer is served on. So they're on a kind of weak TOU rate. So our optimizer in this case is going to have people who can charge at work. Some people will charge at work, and everybody else is going to charge at home as soon as they come home in the evening. It's it's off the main peak, so the TOU rate is kind of helpful, but we're still on a shoulder where there's relatively more expensive electricity. But if we were instead to put them on this kind of idealized time of use rate that exactly tracks the hourly cost, then we get all the charging in the middle of the night. So that tells you the absolute best that you could get, and we've used that in other utilities as a metric for, let's look at like the TOU rate that you're thinking about, and is that getting enough? Like, do you want to be a little bit more aggressive here and capture more of these benefits of using lower cost electricity and shifting, and shifting away from peak capacity hours? What's the balance that you want to strike? Okay, so I'll close with sort of some thoughts that I have, and then maybe we'll sort of set the stage for our conversation over lunch and follow-up conversations with some of you during the day. So I think that the more we work on this, the more we see about what we can do, and the more excited I am about the answers that we can bring to decision makers. So top of my list is, I'm just, so impressed with and really interested in the work on the three revolutions that, Dr. Sperling has launched, and would really like to see us in all of these models really bring in the implications of these other transportation revolutions. So, some pathways cases with a lot of sharing and automation. What does that mean, for the overall transformation of the economy? In a resolve case, what does the flexibility resource look like if suddenly you have like a lot more intensively utilized